Hello, everyone, and welcome this week to Irenicast, the weekly podcast dedicated to conversations on faith and culture. We are your hosts. I'm Jeff.
Hey, I'm Mona.
And I'm Alan.
This week, we're doing things a little out of the ordinary. We have an interview for you this week that we're very excited about. So, Mona, why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, so this person is my friend Nathan, and Nathan identifies as genderqueer. And if you don't know what that means, you will find out. Nathan has an amazing story, very articulate, warm person, and I cannot wait for you all to hear their story.
This interview is great, and I'm excited for everyone to listen to it.
So we're going to move right into the interview. If you have anything that you'd like to add to this conversation or this interview, the show notes can be found at irenicast.com/12. Go there and leave a comment or check out the informational links that we will provide to go a little bit deeper on the things that are discussed in the interview. You can also interact with us on Facebook at facebook.com/irenicast. So for this week, we're going to move right into the interview. We really hope you enjoy.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Irenicast. This week, we're talking about gender. I wanted to sit down with my wonderful, brilliant, lovely friend, Nathan, and talk to them about their life and experiences and take on the world. So, Nathan, how are you today?
Hi, I'm doing pretty good. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I am originally from the West Coast, Washington State to be precise, and I'm what you would call a cradle Catholic. That I grew up kind of within, that I was baptized and raised within the Catholic faith. And I am the beautiful product of 14 years of Catholic education, and that I grew up in a very interesting kind of space within a very liberal state, but within a church that's very conservative in its like politics and how it kind of approaches gender. And that my family, I'm one of four. I'm the second child of what would be considered four boys. And that I grew up kind of the black sheep of my family, that I never really did anything the way my parents wanted me to do. And that I kind of did my own thing without ever really recognizing that I was doing anything different. And my mom very much was encouraging of me and like gave me my room to be myself while still providing a gendered framework. And going into high school, I went to an all-boys Catholic high school. And that for me, like, very much solidified like my understanding of what boys mean, what a boy means, what it means to be a boy, what it means to be a man. And that culture within Catholicism of being a man of God is huge. And what does it mean to be a man of God? And how do you be a warrior for Christ? And this kind of like militaristic, masculine language of how you're supposed to experience your faith as a man. And I was never good at that. And that in high school, I was actually voted most likely to be a Catholic priest, which is hilarious to me in retrospect. And that for me, my faith was my rock. That my youth group was that space where I didn't have to conform in any really specific way, that I could just kind of be me and that people appreciated me, but within that very male, masculinized space that I was also very involved in my faith. I dedicated my life to our campus ministry and started a pro-life club, which was an adventure, to say the least.
Our younger selves.
Right? It's a mess. My younger self is a mess in many ways. And part of it is that like when you like, I identify as queer and I identify as genderqueer, and that when you are a queer person within a very masculinized, straight, male, cisgender, which for those of you who don't know, the term cisgender means not trans. So if you're not trans, you're cisgender. If you don't identify as trans, you're cisgender.
Okay, so even gay people can be cisgender.
Yes.
Okay.
And that and that I identify as gay too. So it's like my sexuality and my gender are two different things.
Yeah, we were trying to get that across in the last episode. That's an unfamiliar concept to a lot of people.
Yeah. And that my mom told me, we were driving home after my college graduation, and we were talking about stories of when I was little. And she said, I really thought you were asexual. And I was like, what do you mean by that? And she's like, well, like you would roll around in the dirt while wearing your best friend's tutu, and you kind of like, you painted your nails, but you also like ripped heads off Barbie dolls. And and I was sitting there listening to my mom tell these stories of kind of how I read me messing with gender expression, messing with what it means to like in gender theory, which is my background academically, that the performance of performing a gender, that I was acting how boys are supposed to act while wearing the clothes that girls are supposed to wear. And my mom read that mismatch of gender expression as me being asexual, that she connected that expression to my sexuality, when really what she was connecting, that what I connected that gender expression with was my gender identity. And as a genderqueer person from birth, I never really fit into the categories of boys and girls. That as a young child, before I was aware of anything, that I knew that how I wanted to express myself was within this collapse. And that even like in like my family and growing up, that there's still that wanting to equate gender expression to sexuality. But in reality, they're very different things.
Well, and if you live in a cisgender straight world where that's normal, yeah, gender and sexuality are basically super linked, and it's hard to see outside of it because straight men like straight women and straight women like straight men.
Yeah.
But if you get outside of those worlds, or if you don't fit those worlds, that can be it sounds like you have to do a lot of work to construct something different. Like you always have to go against the flow, maybe. Yeah.
And for me, I never looked at myself as going against any flow. I thought everybody else was doing what I was doing in the way that they thought they were supposed to do it. And I remember a distinct moment in about like 3rd or 4th grade. I don't remember the kid's name. I think they bullied me, called me a girl or something. And I never got it. I never got why, one, that was an insult, because all my friends were girls. And I was like, I'd never like get mad at my friend who's a girl and be like, you're a girl, because that doesn't make sense. And I remember like, that was kind of like the start of like, oh, how I'm kind of acting, maybe that isn't what everybody's doing. And as I got older and kind of like you hit middle school, and middle school's like awful for everybody. I don't know anybody that has like the glorious middle school days of awkward puberty starting. And
I didn't. I just sailed right through it. No, I think mine lasted like 7 or 8 years.
Yep. And for me, I never developed like when everybody's going through their middle school crushes and everybody's like, oh, Nathan, what girl do you like? And I'm like, I like Lizzie because she's my best friend. Like, that's a good reason to like someone. But I never developed crushes. In middle school, I never had crushes. And part of me, it was like, why do I need a crush when I have like Pokemon? Because it's like,
Is this why your mom thought you might have been asexual?
Yeah, that part of it is like that. In many ways, I was very asexual. Like, I never really had like romantic, like, oh my God, I have a crush on this person. I write their name in my notebook. And even in high school, like going to like, when I say like I went to gay spaces, I'm like, yeah, I went to all a boys' high school. And I get all these looks of like, oh, like that must have been great because there's all these boys. And I'm like, no, it was homophobic and awful. And I didn't have feelings for any of my like classmates because, one, they're talking about awkward conversations in the back of class about our math teacher. And I'm like, that's inappropriate and really uncomfortable for me. And so even though I dated people in high school, I never had romantic feelings for them. Part of it was just kind of like, I felt like this was a thing I needed to do in order to be normal. And so like my first girlfriend was my best friend, and it lasted like 4 months. And then it got to a point where we're like, yeah, can we just go back to being friends? It's a lot easier being friends. Mm-hmm. And then a year later, I dated her best friend for like 9 months. Mm-hmm. And that was nice. Apparently, we used to make out all the time, but I don't remember doing that. So
did you block it out?
I think so. I don't know. Apparently, like everyone talks about like, yeah, Nathan, you were just like making out with her all the time. And I'm like, I don't remember doing that like at all.
So in high school, it sounds like you didn't, you weren't out.
Yeah.
And you didn't have a concept of yourself being sexually different than your peers.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
And that I realized that I was attracted to boys in like 8th grade. Or I was attracted to people who were assigned male at birth. So in gender theory, part of it is that when a baby is born, the doctor looks at their genitals and says, this is a boy and this is a girl. And for trans people, kind of how you talk about that is that the baby's not a boy and the baby's not a girl until the baby says he's a boy, until the baby says she's a girl.
So it's all about self-identification.
It's all about self-identification. And so when you have a baby, the baby is assigned male at birth. The baby is assigned boy. The baby doesn't get a choice in whether or not the baby's a boy. And I'm mostly attracted sexually and romantically to people who are assigned male at birth, no matter what their gender expression, gender identity is. That's just kind of how I fall in the spectrum of things. And in my senior year of high school, I took a literary theory class, and my brain exploded because we got to feminism, and I was like, what?
What is this stuff?
Women have rights? And I'm like, oh my gosh, we can talk about how, like, in all the books we read, women weren't actually, like, characters, but just, like, tropes and ploys. What? There's a language for kind of how I see, and how I see my friends who are girls within media. And then in our literary theory book, there's 6 pages on queer theory. And I think, it was like a short essay on Brokeback Mountain. And I still haven't seen Brokeback Mountain. I know it's about 2 men who might be bisexual because they're both married, but everyone labels them as gay. And they go and work at a sheep farm in the mountains and have
I haven't seen it either. Yeah.
I don't know. But I read those 6 pages over and over and over again. And that was my first connection to what it means to be queer. What
did you think when you encountered this? Like, did you say, hey, this is me finally? Or were you just fascinated by it?
I was fascinated, and I could see myself, but I was still afraid to name myself. And I
want to ask about that. You said recognizing a sense of fear is interesting to me. And so I want to ask this question very carefully.
Yeah.
But was there ever a time that you resisted coming out as being gay? And the reason, some people I think have an easier time of embracing that kind of labeling than others. I have a friend who was not out his entire college career, and he recalls many nights of being afraid to fall asleep because he was afraid that he would have a gay dream and out himself to his roommates. And he became incredibly sleep deprived and just always really afraid of that dynamic. And so, but I know everyone's experience is different. So
that fear definitely existed for me. I wasn't afraid to fall asleep. I really enjoyed my gay dreams, but I was afraid of alcohol. I was afraid of drinking. I was afraid of smoking. I didn't do drugs, didn't drink all of high school. And part of it was that I wanted to be in control of myself. And that when I wasn't in control, I was afraid that I would come out. And my older brother went to college, and he would be like, Nathan, you need to come visit me, and like we can go drinking. And that was like my biggest fear for a majority of my late high school, early college was to go drinking with my brother. I was terrified of getting drunk with my family members because I was afraid of what I would say or what I would do. And
so it's like a fear of your own self.
Yeah, that a lot of queer people kind of experience, not everybody, but a lot of queer people experience kind of like internalized homophobia, internalized transphobia, that our culture doesn't really raise queer people, and I use queer as a kind of an umbrella term to mean LGBTQ because that's a lot of letters to say all at once.
Now. Yeah, LGBTQIA.
I think if I wanted,
there's a new letter every year,
to do the entire alphabet, it would be like LGBTQIAP DG2
R2D2.
Right, yeah. It's like it gets complicated in that like everybody, especially like with like asexuality and intersex identities, that they don't have the visibility that when people see the A in LGBTQIA, they think it means ally, and that's not what it means. It means asexual.
Asexual, yeah.
But for kind of like a lot of queer people, not everybody, like I don't want to essentialize every queer person to my experience, but from talking to my friends, from being in community with other queer people, that a lot of queer people kind of have this internalized homophobic response to themselves and to other gay people, to other queer people. That kind of like, I think of like the worst example would be like Glee, the football player who would beat up Kurt, and then it was really because he himself was gay. Mm-hmm. That this internalized homophobia against other people can manifest itself as violence, can manifest itself as self-violence and self-harm. Mm-hmm. Depression, anxiety are kind of things that come along with this that I've experienced, and that even in like a very liberal state like Washington, that people like to think of Washington as kind of like liberal heaven, which not really, but yes, but no. It's different. It's a different way in which kind of the systems function within liberal spaces. That cis sexism, so the assumption that all people are cisgender, all people are not trans, exists within liberal spaces. That homophobia exists within liberal spaces. Transphobia exists. Racism exists. Classism. All the things that help subjugate people exist within liberal spaces. Liberal spaces are not safe. Which, unfortunately, like myself included, like we like to think of ourselves as being good liberals who have nice, safe spaces for all the marginalized people, but that's not always true. And
yeah. So I wonder for some of our listeners who don't have a lot of experience with gay friends or gay culture at all, if you can, I would wonder if you could go into a little bit more about, having said that, about all of the kind of the anxieties and the things that go along with just being different in a lot of ways. If you can explain for some of our listeners what it means to come out and to adopt a label for yourself. Like, why is that so significant?
I think it's significant. It's important because you get control over yourself again. Mm-hmm. That growing up when you are queer, whether you're L, G, B, or T, or Q, or I, or A, or any variant on the spectrum of queerness, that you're told your entire life who you are. And when you realize that who you've been told you are is not who you are, and you finally get the courage and the empowerment and the strength to say, no, you're wrong. I know who I am, and this is who I am, that I am genderqueer, I am gay, I am these things, that it is liberating, it's empowering, but it's also terrifying. That I was very fortunate with my own, that when people tend to think of like gay and queer experiences as like, it falls within like the coming out narrative. Mm-hmm. And that typically the story that everybody wants to know is like coming out to your family. That's the story that everybody really likes to hear, because you are constantly coming out. You don't just like come out and you're out.
I'm here, world.
Right?
Look at
me. Yeah, because everyone's going to read you as straight until you tell them. Everyone's going to read you as cis until you tell them. And like when I came out to my mom, her, in much nicer words, how I remember it is pretty much the gist of it was, and pardon my language, no shit, honey, I knew that when you were 3. And that my mom was very, very loving, very, very affirming, welcoming, and part of it, and that then she went on, she's a nurse, and then she went on a 20-minute conversation on AIDS and safe sex, and being like, you're not good, because my parents both were kind of raised, they went to college during the 80s, during the high point of the AIDS epidemic. So to my parents, being gay means you're going to get AIDS and die. And to my mom, that is her biggest fear.
Yeah, I think for boomers who lived through that, or who saw that, or who had their own friends suffer from AIDS, like that really is a real thing. Yeah,
and that trauma that I feel like a lot of the baby boomer generation's phobia of their homophobia is rooted in the AIDS epidemic. That trauma that nobody really talks about. Nobody talks about the AIDS epidemic anymore, really. Mm-hmm. But that trauma still lingers. Mm-hmm. And my mom, within like a week after I came out, she sat me down and she was telling me how my dad's best friend in college, his older brother was gay and got AIDS, and told his parents, and they rejected him. And his response was to go down to their basement and kill himself.
God.
And that is the language of being gay that my parents grew up in. Like, and my dad's older sister's a lesbian. But I never knew growing up. We didn't talk about it ever. She has my Aunt Jan is her partner is my Aunt Judy, and I grew up knowing them my entire life. My Aunt Jan is my godmother, which foreshadowing. My lesbian aunt is my godmother. I think that's great. But we didn't talk about them being lesbians. That I grew up calling my Aunt Judy, but just thinking that she was my aunt's best friend who I called aunt. That I never was raised in a space that affirmed queer people or that allowed queer people to be called queer people, like named, like nobody ever talked about my aunts as lesbians. And I remember being 14 and they came up to visit from California and we're sitting there at dinner and I'm like watching them and I'm like, oh my God, you're lesbians. My aunts are lesbians. Oh my gosh, I have gay people in my family. As like a closeted baby gay 14-year-old, I was like, well, if they don't talk about my aunts being lesbians, are they going to talk about me? I came out when I was 18 to my parents, but it was kind of like this, okay, my parents know, nobody really needs to know other than that. And slowly I've come out more and more and more. And most of my family knows now. And that I specifically have come out as gay, that I haven't addressed the gender issue. Mostly because from my parents' culture of growing up, the Catholic culture of growing up, that the gender binary is a very big thing. Mm-hmm. And my best friend is genderqueer and came out to my mom knows they're genderqueer, and my mom is trying really hard to like respect their pronouns because my mom is the best person in the world. But I don't know how they're going to react to me coming out as genderqueer. Mm-hmm. And I've never. So
that's a separate coming out process for you.
Yeah, that you come out in a lot of different ways, and it's funny because like in like coming out like in queer circles, it's really awkward to be a queer person of faith. It's really awkward.
Well, and I'm listening to you talk, and so many stereotypes that I can think of that are perpetuated in wider culture, like you just smash them all.
Yeah.
Like you're not this ruckus, like like the vision that you're painting of yourself. You're not an uber promiscuous youth that's just trying to buckle authority and buckle systems. And you're just like this. You're like just this little kid who's like doesn't want to go out and drink and do bad things, you know?
Yeah.
And wanted to do the right thing by people and wanted to love your family. And so I think the image of someone who just knows they're different from a young age and still loves God and still wants to be in faith, like all of that really goes against the kind of the narrative that is with like the Christian right media. A lot of times it's like the gay agenda and all of this, like all gay people want the same thing magically and they're just out to destroy society and families. And I mean, I think until my, if I can say a quick thing, until Mona started getting to know people of different backgrounds and different persuasions and different sexualities and genders, it's hard to know how people operate outside cisgender culture. Mm-hmm. Like I said in the earlier gender episode, that I don't think of myself walking around the world every single moment of my waking day thinking about how I encounter the world as a woman, right? I don't eat a piece of bread thinking I'm a woman, but I'm a cisgender, straight, for the most part, woman. And so maybe the way that I perform my gender is so intrinsic that I just never have to think about how I eat a piece of bread. It never has to dawn on me because the way that I'm instinctively function is so in line with that cisgender vision of womanhood.
And part of it is like, one, there's no way to be genderqueer, that by being yourself you are being genderqueer, by dressing yourself you are being genderqueer. And you'll never...
Wait, who? Like you?
Like me, other genderqueer people, that people who are gender variant, non-binary, agender, trans, just like not necessarily trans male or trans, not necessarily trans man or trans woman, that who kind of function within the binary, but there are non-binary things that real complicated.
Yeah, complicated. But there's an essence of like when you are, depending on who you are and how you are how you operate as your person, you will be more or less aware of how you perform gender than others.
Yeah, I wake up every day, and when I look at my closet, I think about, how do I want to express myself today? Do I want to be butch? Do I want to be masculine? Do I want to be femme? Do I want to be feminine? Do I want to mess with gender in a way that I want people to question whether or not I'm a man or a woman? And it's really hard for me to do that. Y'all can't see me, but I'm like a 6'2", like 250, like, if you saw me, you'd be like, that is a big white dude. And in reality, how I interact with my gender, I wouldn't say like I think about my gender when I eat a piece of toast, but when I'm walking down the street, depending on what I'm wearing, I'm hyper aware of everybody that walks past me. And that I tend to dress more butch. I like to say that my aesthetic is an REI lesbian, like flannel, puffy vest, hiking boots is like my thing.
Washington State, though.
Washington State, really, though. Everybody in Washington State just dresses like lesbians. It's great.
Okay, but this kind of begs the question. I know you're like saying this in jest, but like, what does a lesbian dress
exactly?
like?
That's
the point. Okay, so my question for you is: does gender matter? And if it matters, why does it matter?
It matters because it's real.
Is it real because it's fundamentally universally real, or is it real because we perform it to such an extent that it's real?
It depends on, like, if you want to go like the very academic, theoretical, post-structuralist, like, gender is a social construction. The violence and the impact of gender that your gender performance has is real. And that's what makes gender matter. Is that when a trans woman is walking down the street and gets assaulted and murdered.
That is real.
That is real.
Yeah.
And especially for trans people whose genders tend to get erased more often. Kind of like every time I go to mass and they're like, brothers and sisters of Christ. And I'm like, I am not a brother or a sister. And apparently I'm not with Christ right now. And yes, I can like assimilate myself into like the and, or that I can be like, yeah, no, I know that they're being inclusive. I know that I am part of this, but the language around gender is so important, and that because of our language, it has real impacts on the physical violence, the physical narrative of what it means to be a trans person, what it means to be a gay person, that in many ways kind of like how you express your gender, one is very much a performance. Like you wear a dress because you want to make intentionally or unintentionally, you are making a statement about yourself using societal codes of what a dress means. When you are a 250-pound white dude wearing a dress, you make people really uncomfortable.
Well, it is unmistakably a statement.
Yeah.
Whatever that statement means, it is a statement.
It's a statement, and that with that statement, you open yourself up to violence. And that's part of the reality, but I feel like especially with trans narratives, people get so wrapped up in the violence. And I want to say that the violence is real and the violence needs to be held, but I don't want the violence to overpower the joy. And that like my trans sisters and siblings who are non-conventionally femme, who walk down the street with full beard, knowing that they don't pass as a woman, but they are being themselves. That is empowered. That is the work of God in my life. That they are willing to stand and be who they are and be made in the image of God in the face of someone who wants to murder them.
Wow. That's really courageous. I mean, really, I think for those of us who don't have to go through that, like, it's just really hard to understand that your being can be you're just your being, you're just your existence, and the way that you happen to say certain words or the colors that you happen to be wearing could be a fundamental threat to your own life. It's hard to comprehend.
And it's real. Like within what month? It's March. I think 15 trans women, mostly trans women of color, have been murdered since January.
So when you get that conflation of sexism and racism, so and what we call that in academic circles is intersectional, because you have overlapping systems of oppression hitting at the same time.
Yeah.
And bell hooks is someone who's kind of pioneered that. But that it can be very dangerous. And so I think I know a lot of straight people who would say, well, like, why risk it? Yeah. Why risk it? Why is it so important to quote unquote be yourself is what they would say. Why not just conform?
I think part of it is, one, conforming is boring. Sorry to anybody who really granted, no. I think conforming is boring. But
I do too. But not everybody thinks that.
But not everybody thinks that. I'm respectful of people who like conformity. Conformity is logical. It makes sense. Mm-hmm. I think part of it is that desire to... That you have the right to be yourself just as much as your straight or cis sibling. That whether or not I'm with blue, purple, green hair, or if it's a crew cut, I have the right to express who I am and how I view myself in how I am created in the image of God, in the same way that my straight and cis siblings are allowed to be who they are and perform who they are as an image of God.
It sounds like that concept's really life-giving for you. Can you say more about that?
Like
the image of God.
The image of God.
Because image of God, that's like one of the principal argumentations I understand for people who like promote marriage between man and a woman. Yeah. They're like, God made a man, God made a woman, God made Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. Exactly. And therefore people just need to like fall in line. But okay, so for the image of God, like to find life in that in different ways than that majority sort of storytelling.
Yeah, and for me that goes into, so my academic work is queer theology. That's what I want to pursue. That's what I want to do. And in queer theology is this hodgepodge of queer theory, feminist theory, and history, autobiography, and systematic theologies, and it's a lot of things. It's very complicated, and I don't fully comprehend everything.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. If I can interrupt, because I really want to hear the answer. But quickly, for our listeners who are not familiar with what queer theory and feminist theory are, you could write several books on explaining this, but can you do it in like 2 or 3 sentences?
Queer theory, depending on who you talk to, is one way of interpreting it is the theories around gender and sexuality that are intuitively against heteronormative, which means the normalization of heterosexuality within, at least in my background, American culture. That heteronormativity exists in other cultures, but I can't speak to other cultures. And feminist theory is kind of the theories around what it means to be a woman, what does woman look like, but also within the third wave movement, like anyone can be a feminist, and that kind of like defining, kind of expanding, and that in many ways queer and feminist theory all kind of centralize around gender and sexuality and mix match, kind of like connect in fun ways, and that queer theory and queer theology are inherently rooted in feminist theory, and rooted in feminist theologies.
So these things all talk to each other.
They all talk to each other.
And theology talks to each other.
Yeah.
There's an idea in classic or orthodox theologies, whether you're Catholic or whether you're Protestant, that there's like the real theology, where it's like objective and sort of scientific, and it, which tends to be done by straight white men.
Yep.
That their theology is the normal or the quote unquote real theology, and then like theology done from any other perspective is like fringe, or not real. And actually, someone told me this when in college. I read one essay in our whole history of theology class from a feminist theologian, and I went to my professor afterwards and I said, "What is this stuff? I'm fascinated by this." Kind of like you when you read that queer theory section. I was like, "I have to. What is this?" He said, "Well, this is fringe theology, so you want to stay away from this. This is not real." He told me this, like exact verbatim. This isn't the real stuff. If you want to be taken seriously as a theologian, you stay away from this stuff, okay?
That's the best stuff.
Yeah, first of all, it's the most interesting, forward-thinking, and most justice-oriented theology out there. And also, in my opinion, Jesus was a fringe kind of person. Mm-hmm. And I think Jesus would be in dialogue on the fringes with people, and was like, he ate and drank with tax collectors and prostitutes. I think Anyway, so I just want to give a little shout out that there is no such thing as an objective theology. We all come from a point of view. We all have lenses. We all have glasses we look through. Okay, so so that's kind of like the background between queer theory, feminist theory, systematic theology, and how all these things come together. Okay, so back to image of God.
So in image, so a lot of queer theology goes back to this image of God. A lot, and my background as like in Catholic theology, that the Pope John Paul II's teachings on human sexuality, the theology of the body, goes back to this notion of image of God, that all people are created in the image and likeness of God, and that all people have innate human dignity. And that is like, and within queer theology, they kind of push back against the Adam and Steve, or the Adam and Eve kind of like narrative. But they also, specifically from like trans theology, that being made in the image of God, like if you go back to the Hebrew, the work I'm doing right now is working within the Genesis 2 narrative, and Adam in Hebrew, ha-Adam, doesn't translate to man. It translates to earth creature that is made in the image and likeness of God. That the first person God creates doesn't have a gender.
Yeah, Adam is not a pronoun, a proper pronoun.
Yeah.
Adam, it just translates as human.
Yeah, it translates as human. That the first person God creates is just a human. And that God then puts Adam asleep, removes Adam's rib, and turns that rib into Eve, or woman. And that there's a linguistical shift that in that moment, Adam turns into Ish. And Ish is Hebrew for man.
Ish and Isha, right?
Ish and Isha, yeah. So man and woman are created in the act of pulling the rib. And kind of from that you can read that Adam, you can read Adam, that first Adam, as every humanity, you can read it in kind of this humanity is made in the image and likeness of God. And I like to believe that trans people and queer people and gay people are part of humanity. So therefore we are also made in the image and likeness of God. And that, I mean, and that for me is really important, that I can be in God's image. And part of it is that the history of Christianity in relationship to queer people is not a pretty one. It's not nice. It's not fluffy. And that growing up, even within like Catholic spaces, where like Catholics are kind of viewed as like homophobic, but they're not like Westboro Baptist homophobic. That they're like don't ask, don't tell homophobic. And but in like my Christian morality class in high school, my teacher told us that homosexuals are intrinsically evil.
Wow. Against
natural law. That in Catholic theology, natural law is everything. Thank you, Thomas Aquinas. That natural law dictates everything.
So what is natural law?
Natural law is the easy term is that natural law is that when God created the world, he had a very specific order for it. That natural law is God's intended order for the world through nature.
And so the concept of right and wrong are like written on the hearts of people, right? This kind of the same like kind of Lockean, John Locke like kind of continued this. So like the morality is like universal set of right and wrong, and it's instinctual. It
is in the order of the world, and that what homosexuals, which is a very like, if you call a gay person a homosexual, that's like a red flag. Like, don't do that. That will, like, that's nobody in the LGBT queer community use the word homosexual.
Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
actually,
like it's a very charged word, and so you just call him gay. He is a gay man. She's a lesbian. She's a gay woman. They.
A lot of my lesbian friends really resist the term lesbian, and I'm not expecting you to answer this for me, but I think that's a really great point to like actually ask people what they prefer to be called and listen to them and try to be really attentive to the language because the language around all of this matters so much.
Yeah, and with natural law. Within like Catholic theology of the body, that your physical body is made in the image and likeness of God, and that body falls within the natural law, that your body, your identity falls within this expected order of the world. Queer people are disordered. They break away from that order. because God created man and woman in complementariness, and that same-sex relationships are inherently, like, they don't procreate, that they aren't made in that Adam and Eve image, so therefore they're not made in the image of God. But I push back against that. I think that's kind of messy, especially when you get into gender, because when you have a trans man, so a person who is assigned female at birth, who is a man and has a vagina, is in a relationship with, say that's a gay trans man, and he's in a relationship with a gay cis man, so a gay cisgender man who has a penis, they can procreate, and they are still a gay relationship.
Okay.
And according to natural law, that gay relationship is within natural law because it is procreative.
Interesting.
And that you can have a lesbian trans woman or a genderqueer person with a vagina in a relationship with a cisgender man.
So in Catholic theology, gender is so inextricably linked to sexuality because of the teachings on sexuality.
Exactly.
And that sex needs to be procreative in general.
In general.
And then that has implications for
and
how
that's
people
why
perform
contraceptives are bad. That's why masturbation is bad. That's why...
In Catholic
sexual teachings.
Yeah.
And as a very devout Roman Catholic, I'm not very devout. I'm remotely devout. I accept all the church teachings, but I also recognize that church teachings can change and that they can only change from within the institution. And that's kind of why I'm still here. I'm here until they kick me out. That's really what it is. It's like,
so my question, okay, so I'm a Protestant, Pentecostal raised, freewheeling American, I'm like, why? I understand and I respect, people from different persuasions, but my internal voice is like, why would you stay with someone who takes a crap on you?
Yeah.
That's a really visceral image.
Oh, it's real.
I really mean it.
Yeah.
I really do mean it because some of the things that some religious institutions say about gay and queer people are so sickening. And
Pope Francis compared trans people to nuclear weapons last week.
Okay, and I've heard this from the Protestant side as well. I've heard people talk about trans bathrooms as being inherently perverse and unsafe. Yeah. Really, some people really do think that trans and queer people, they equate them one-to-one to pedophiles. Yeah. Even though statistically there are fewer per capita pedophiles who are out and queer or gay or whatever. And so it's not only ignorant and spiteful, but it to me kind of bespeaks this really sad understanding of humanity itself and what safety is and is not. Yeah, definitely. Right? Yeah. And so as a queer Catholic theologian, I'm hearing you derive so much meaning in life from your faith and your relationship with God and with religion. Yeah. Which is how many of you are there? Are you a unicorn? What?
There are, in terms of
I mean, I know a few, but I think a lot of people don't meet.
We're a fun group. There's a couple very affirming, welcoming Catholic organizations. Dignity USA is one. New Ways Ministry are both very, very affirming. Granted, they both tend to fall within kind of we're LGB sort of T inclusive. Okay. That in most welcoming and affirming churches are really good about the L and the G, and then when you get to the BTQ, they kind of go,
because they're still wrapped in gender binaries, right? Exactly, yeah. So there's still a lot of, and that's why I think it's important for people to understand. First of all, while there is no gay agenda, and there's a huge diversity in LGBTIQA communities, there is still a lot of anti-trans mentality that maybe is homophobia has just shifted into anti-trans or something.
I think homophobia still exists. I think the fact that in many church spaces, no matter how welcoming they are, unless they need to empower the queer people of their congregations. If I, as a queer person, walk into a welcoming and affirming church and realize that there's no out queer people on any of the ministry teams or as the pastor or in the administration, if there's no out queer people in even a welcoming space, that says something about that space.
Which I'm thinking of churches that claim to be really interracial, but everybody in leadership is white. Yeah. Then it's not really
affirming. And so the homophobia has taken, in the same way that homophobia has taken a different shift in liberal spaces. In liberal church spaces, homophobia looks a lot different. It doesn't go away unless you actively combat it and are intentional. Transphobia is the same way. that transphobia, like every time you say brothers and sisters in Christ, you are alienating an entire group of people who don't fall within brothers and sisters. Queer people going into conservative and liberal churches are going to have a hard time. And especially like within like Catholic contexts, like I've been in ministry positions where as soon as I started becoming more vocally out, they removed me from my position.
In your church?
In my ministry. I was on a college ministry. And they didn't necessarily remove me, or I removed myself because they asked me to go back in the closet. And that's not something I could do. And that at the same time, that was happening, I was part of in college, I was part of the Vagina Monologues.
Eve Ensler.
Yeah. So my undergrad did this thing called the Vagina Memoirs, where people from our community stood up and told memoirs of their lives. Not the play, rather wrote their own.
Oh, wow.
And a lot of various minority groups look to that as kind of a framework to create their own space where they can share their stories. And so at the same time I was going through all this stuff in my ministry program, I was also doing what was called the Queer Experience, which was our kind of take on the Vagina Memoirs. And my family, my castmates, these lovely folks that I spent like 3 months working on this performance of our lives with, always said that talking to me was like going to church, and that all of them have had very negative experiences with religion. And I was like this weird, I'm a unicorn. I'm this weird anomaly that in the face of being simultaneously like that, like being told I'm intrinsically evil and against natural law, and the conservative Catholics, we're not saying you are, it's the actions. That the Catholic Church creates a divide between the person and the actions, that homosexual actions are intrinsically evil and against natural law, but the homosexual person themselves is loved child of God. So kind of like this hate the sin, not the sinner kind of mentality, which that's a whole other story. But within queer spaces, there is a need for spiritual growth, that there's a lot of queer Wiccans. There's a lot of queer pagans. There are a lot of queer people of faith. There are queer Muslims, queer Jews, queer Buddhists, queer Hindus, that queer people of faith exist. But when you walk into predominantly queer spaces, you're assumed to be atheist or agnostic, or I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And when you do say that you are a queer person of faith, like when I say that I'm studying, I tell my friends I go to Jesus school. And that you get a very mixed reaction, because that's not something queer people are supposed to do. That queer people fall within the same traps of performativity that straight people do, that there are certain things queer people are supposed to do. Radical queer people are supposed to be anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist, anti-homophobic.
And anti-religion.
And anti-religion. Yeah. And then when you have a queer person who is anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-sexist, but is very much dedicated to their home, their church, it creates a weird tension. And then I like to live in that tension because I think it's fun. And I think that it opens doors for conversations. And I've had amazing conversations with queer people who don't normally get to talk about religion or talk about their experiences of the violence and abuse and mistreatment and discrimination that they experienced within Christian spaces.
And this is like most people you talk to?
Most people I talk to. And that like when I go out with some of the other queer people at my seminary, we got to gay bars, and then you're talking to someone and they're like, oh, what do you do? And you say, well, I'm a grad student in divinity. I'm studying Jesus. And it usually goes in one of two directions. One, they either leave. They just are like, nope, not touching that hot potato.
Wait, let me guess a second. They confess their sins to you?
They either confess their sins or they tell me their entire life
religious history with
God. And I'm like, and I understand
this happens to me too. They tell me their whole, well, I went to church till I was 5, and I'm like, why are you telling me all
this?
I
want to drink a beer and maybe make out with you. I don't want to listen, and part of it is like I'm an academic. I'm not a pastoral person, so I'm really bad at pastoral care. I'm really bad at wanting to sit down in spaces that aren't built for touchy-feely spaces and be touchy-feely. I'm really bad at that, and I own my own faults in this. And so my friends who I'm with, who are going to be pastors, are like, "Oh, like tell me more. Like, what do you think about this?" And I'm like, "You can't see my face right now, but it's not a happy face."
I think you just gave side eyes to the camera.
That's really what
to
it
the
was.
mic.
That's
yeah.
really what it was. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting space to be a very out queer person who's studying religion in both queer spaces. Then when you go into Christian spaces, well, I have blue hair, so people kind of stare at me anyways. But when you come out as queer within Christian spaces, people don't really know what to do, because Christian spaces are assumed to be straight and cis. That when you think about Adam and Eve, you think about Adam as a man with a penis, and you think about Eve as a woman with a vagina. But if you read man and woman within kind of this deconstructed gender way, that Adam's a man. Nobody really knows what a man is. So anybody who identifies as a man can see themselves in that man version of Adam.
Yeah.
And anyone who identifies as a woman can see themselves in Eve. And then you have people like me who don't really see themselves as man or woman. And then that's the struggle of, where do I see myself in the Bible? And that's where I go to Jesus. That's what I look at Jesus as kind of transgressing against gender roles. A lot of good early feminist theologians kind of talked about how Jesus subverted patriarchy.
Transgressing meaning like just breaking rules.
Yeah.
Like breaking boundaries that have been placed, like kind of messing with them, toying with them, breaking them if they don't make sense or they're not life-giving.
And
right?
that a lot of queer theologians have looked at the intimate relationships of Jesus with other people and looking at the intimacy between him and the beloved disciple, the intimacy between him and Mary Magdalene, the intimacy between him and Lazarus, and kind of have read Jesus in this queer lens to be kind of a pansexual, this meaning like Jesus is attracted to all people.
And that, what you're saying,
Yeah.
and I think it's easy for people who've been raised in conservative spaces to see that as like a dirty thing, of like a perverse kind of like kinky.
Yeah.
But thinking about it as just true relationship, true and genuine relationship.
That Jesus is willing to be physically, not physically in the sense of sexual, but physically intimate with other human beings in ways that, from our modern or American perspective, like, you don't walk down the street and wash a stranger's feet. You don't touch people's feet. That's weird. Unless you're like dating them and they want a foot rub or other things. But Jesus washed the feet of his friends. He held people. He touched people. And that he had a very physical relationship.
He wept in people's presence.
He wept. He
didn't
cried.
have emotional walls. Yeah, but I'm picking up on this too. Like there are a few things in theology that really get me, but the deep knowingness of God demonstrating that to us, and then us going out and showing that to others. That really, that connection and that relationship is so in the core of what faith should be. Yeah. And that for me, I kind of see myself in Jesus and I see myself in Mary. And Catholics love Mary. Like, if you meet a Catholic who doesn't love Mary, that's a problem, because Mary is perfect. And I'm biased. I own my bias. And Mary, to me, is this... People always read Mary as this weak and meek and humble and graceful. And that's not who I see. When you see, like, the wedding at Cana, and Mary's like, no, you're doing this. Mary got stuff done. Mary was the only person who told Jesus what to do. And Jesus listened. True. And my other favorite thing is that, I think it's the Gospel of Matthew, when the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and is like, yo, God wants you to bear God's son. And Mary's like, okay, yeah, let it be done. That Mary gave consent. Mary had ownership of her body. Is like, from like a very like feminist perspective, I'm like, yeah, that is actively, that Mary is the symbol of anti-rape culture, which is huge within the queer community, which is huge within the straight and cis world. And that I draw a lot of strength from Mary, that I see Mary as like a role model, but also as like my own, like, Mary's my spiritual mom. Like, one of my friends talked about how their grandma is in constant conversation with Mary. And I think that's the coolest way to pray, that you can be that one of the things Catholics have are
saints and Mary, and people get really uncomfortable with that. And but to be in constant spiritual conversation with a spiritual advisor who's the mother of God is phenomenal to me. That if you walked into my room, there's like 7 rosaries. It's kind of a problem. And that Mary is a very important figure in the Bible that nobody other than feminists like to talk about.
So so you're getting something I think really significant, that it is so just the irony of ironies to me.
Yeah.
That queer people would be trying to teach the world about respectful, consensual love.
Right? And that they're the ones who are seen of doing dirty love. They're the ones who are seen as acting immorally in love. And we're the ones who queer people and survivors.
And maybe it's because people who have experienced a high degree of trauma and rejection are so much more sensitive to how to show love in ways that really do honor the other person. Yeah,
and that there is still abuse at the same rates in queer relationships that there are in straight relationships. And nobody likes to talk about gay marriage in terms of divorce rate, in terms of abuse, domestic partnership abuse, because they want gay marriage to stay this happy, new, beautiful thing. And in reality, it's not. It suffers the same plagues as straight marriage in many ways, plus the added bonus of homophobia. And that it's kind of that marriage is this messy. I don't like to talk about marriage very often because as an anti-assimilationist queer, I'm kind of to me, marriage is something that should only exist within the church. And that I think part of this conversation has really shown that everything's very interconnected, and especially in that theological plane and that for queer theologians, it's kind of you have to scrape the bottom of the barrel because you are on the fringe, but you're that fringe piece that that everybody up until 1970 has been saying, ew.
There's something psychologically
demented, and now you're making theology. And one, it's really powerful to claim God back for yourself. And that's something that very few, that many marginalized groups can say that they've taken part in, that various theological movements have reclaimed, Black Jesus, there's the Christa within feminist Latina theologies. And that in the work of Robert Goss and Patrick Chang and Marcella Althaus Reed, that there's this reclaiming of the queer Christ and reclaiming of the queer God that makes conservative straight people very uneasy because nobody likes to think about their Jesus as gay.
And it's just a lot of change. I think even people who aren't intentionally homophobic, it's just
lot of
messing with something you've think you've known your whole life, and so that's uncomfortable too.
And part of it is that from the other side is that you're messing with it so that you can finally understand why you feel comfort in this. That when I go to Mass, the rituals, the orthodoxy, I live for orthodoxy in Mass. Outside of Mass, no. But within the confines of my church space, that conservative reverence is very important to me.
Why?
I think part of it is that in those moments of conservative reverence are where I've come to know God the most. That the Eucharist, I'm new to Protestantism, and I'm learning that sermons are usually 45 minutes long, and I don't know what to do with that.
Eucharist, for those who don't know, is communion.
Oh yeah, communion.
It's called communion in non-sacramental, more when you teach it, it's more of a symbolic. But Catholics believe that you're really actually partaking in the body and blood of Christ. It becomes the real body and blood of Christ.
It is the essence is the literal body and the literal blood. That it still tastes like cardboard and wine, but you're allowing Christ to enter yourself on a very physical level. And for me, that's very, very intimate. A lot of Catholic theologians, or a lot of queer, formerly Catholic theologians have written a lot about the eroticism of that. And I really like that. I think it's fun to kind of mess with that. And a part of it is I don't see eroticism as irreverent. And that,
or icky.
Yeah.
But it's part of who we are as sexual beings.
Yeah. And that even that you are allowed to be sexual in Mass. Not I'm going to go bang someone in the bathroom, but I'm going to allow to experience my whole self in Mass, and part of my whole self is very sexual.
I think that there is something there. There's something there. I think we need to recognize our views on sexuality and gender as a whole, and how we're taught to see these things as like things that we need to distrust and be afraid of in a lot of ways. So this has been so good.
Yeah.
This has been so good. I hate to wrap it up, but I want to ask you 2 questions.
Yeah.
And we'll totally have to have you on again because this has been just wonderful. And I've learned a lot from you today. So first of all, just wanting to note that, yes, you can be queer and Christian.
Yes.
You can be queer and religious.
Yes.
So my 2 questions for you are, 1, what do you recommend for people to build more inclusive spaces? And 2, do you have any resources to point people toward?
I think 1 is challenge yourself to walk into every space and assume that everybody in that space is queer.
Oh, that's interesting. Can you say more about that?
That so much of the time that you walk in, queer people, like I'm guilty of this too, that you walk into a space and you assume that everybody is like the norm. That unlike other marginalized identities, queerness tends to be invisible until they come out, or unless they fulfill the stereotypes that a queer person is supposed to be.
So it's not like having skin of a certain pigment.
Yeah.
Which that has a whole slew of problems in itself to just assume. But you're right. It is more invisible than other identity markers.
Yeah, it's more invisible than other identity markers. So walking into that space and assuming that everybody in that space, everyone in that church is queer. And really challenge yourself to educate yourself on like that. The internet is a great resource that if you don't know really where to go, or if you don't like just Google like gay and Christian or gay, like if you want to know more about like specifically queerness, you can Google that. Like feel self-empowered to educate yourself and feel like that it's okay to be curious, that it's okay to not know something and to want to learn it. Mm-hmm. And I think resource-wise, it depends on kind of where you want to go. If you want to kind of like Tumblr, I think is a great resource. Tumblr. Gay Christians on Tumblr are on point. Queer people on Tumblr are on point with a lot of things. But also to kind of like, part of it is like the academics has a certain language to it, but when you go into like Tumblr, which is kind of this weird communal blog space, that people are writing in accessible language and people are writing about their lived experiences.
Do you have any favorite bloggers?
God in the Brokenness, .tumblr. Or no, God of the Oppressed. No, God of the Broken. I will send you a list.
We'll put them in the show notes.
You'll put them in the show notes because I'll write a list. And I think part of it is also really actively engaging with listening to the stories and the lives of queer people. Mm-hmm. I Am Driftwood is an online archive of 5-minute videos of queer people telling stories of their lives.
Oh, that's cool.
And not just like the popularized, like, I came out to my, like, kind of like the chosen narratives, but rather ones that to people who aren't queer wouldn't really seem like much. Like you're like your first date or your the first time you tried on high heels. Like these big milestones in these queer people's lives that from an outsider perspective, you're kind of like, why is that a big deal? Like that's normal. But for that person, it's something powerful. So I Am Driftwood is a great video archive. Slam poetry teaches me more than anything else. Andrea Gibson is a queer slam poet who uses a lot of Christian imagery in all of her poems and talks about religion. And she's no way very... she's probably spiritual. She doesn't like, I'm this Christian denomination. She doesn't identify herself as a Christian poet or anything, but she uses that imagery, and that's part of her history through her poems. Nadia Bowles-Weber is a Lutheran pastor who... I
love her. She's
perfect. Well, not perfect, but like she's up there. She's almost to the ideal of what my brain consists perfect is. She's in many ways up there. Her autobiography, Pastrix, talks a lot about gender and queerness in the journey of becoming a pastor.
And that's Pastrix, correct?
Yes. Pastrix, yeah. And I bawled my way through most of that book.
Wow.
It was...
Nadia Bowles-Weber is the name of the person. Yeah, just to
Nadia
say it again.
Bowles-Weber. She's a Lutheran pastor whose home church is the House for Sinners and Saints in Denver, Colorado. She's great. And I think part of it is be gentle with yourself in the learning process.
And I have to say, like, even having this interview, like, I know a little bit about queer theory, but I'm so afraid that I'm going to, like, make you into my token queer friend. And, like, you have to speak for all queer people. So, you know, this has been a cool experience for me, you know, just sitting and talking to you and, like, learning more about your life. Yeah.
And that being gentle with yourself, and I'm bad at this, I'm really bad at this, is one of the most important things you can do in this kind of education work, because you're going to mess up. And you're gonna say the wrong thing, and you're going to offend someone. But offending someone isn't being bad. It's that, like, a lot of people are like, don't make assumptions. And my kind of response to that, no, you're gonna make assumptions. It is human nature to make assumptions. But what you can do is change the way you respond to when your assumptions are wrong. That if you meet someone and you're like, that is a boy because they look like a boy and how I understand boy, and then they're like, I'm a girl. Don't fight them on that. Because all they did was say your assumption was wrong. And it's okay to be wrong in your assumptions. And that you can be gentle with yourself and be like, oh, I'm sorry, I misgendered you. Want to go get coffee, kind of thing. That you can work to create kind of like a safer space for trans people specifically, and gay people, and all the people of the queer community, and recognizing that we're not one monolith identity who wants this certain agenda, but rather we are each individuals, and we are a community of difference. And that in a lot of queer spaces, that difference is what holds us together while also dividing us. And that's part of kind of like the metaphysics of queer theory. That's really complicated, and that's a whole big thing. But the point is that you try, even though it's not perfect. You try, even though, and you keep trying, and you're gonna mess up. And myself as an ally, I try in the best way that I know how, and I try to make it a learning process. Yeah. And there are going to be days when the queer people who you're interacting with don't want to educate you and don't want to talk to you. Because it's not your job to educate me. If you choose to do it, that's one thing. And there are going to be days where that you can have that from the side of the person who lives it. You can only have these conversations so many times, but at the same time, a lot of queer people want to have these conversations, because very rarely do queer people of faith get asked, other than why are you? I get asked a lot of why are you still there? That's one question people like to ask, and I was like, that's a fair question. That I ask myself that too, but also kind of like, how do you see yourself in God? How do you how do you love God? How do you what ways do you pray? And that you'll find, especially like for me, that my prayer is very queer. That my prayer.
What do you mean by that?
My prayers involve me. They involve my body. They involve who I think about. They involve. I pray the rosary a lot, and in each decade I pray for a different issue that my community is facing. There's a moment in Mass during the prayers of what Protestants would call prayers of the people, where they say, listen to the now time for the prayers in the silence of our hearts. And in each time, every Mass, I pray for all of the homeless queer youth who have been kicked out of Christian homes. And that bringing those prayers into those Christian spaces makes those Christian spaces a little bit more queer.
Yeah, that's true.
And and I know that at least one person, and I know there are more of us, who are praying to God for ourselves and for our community, and for our straight and cisgender siblings who are slowly learning to love us in the way that we deserve to be loved.
That is so good. Yeah. And I'm right there with you.
Yeah.
That's what I want too.
Yeah.
So let me ask you one more question. What is the biggest thing you long for spiritually and from a spiritual community as a queer person?
I think part of it is, and this is my Catholicness, my spiritual needs tend to get fulfilled in very orthodox rituals that I love. Adoration, which is where Blessed Sacrament, the Eucharist, the body of Christ, the bread, is put in a special container called the monstrance, and you meditate in front of it for however long you want to meditate for it. And typically I do like 2 hours. And I pray the rosary, I'll read books, I'll read poetry, and that God tends to show God's self to me in those moments of very reverent silence. And that's where I get spiritually nourished, because most Christian spaces, I tend to get angry or upset, or that I get silenced in such a way that I need those moments of actual silence, like spiritual silence, in order to center myself again.
That's really contemplative and such a beautiful vision of spiritual practice. So would you say you long for the spiritual spaces that you do have access to outside your own home? Like, do you long for those to be safer spaces for you?
I don't think the Catholic Church will ever become a safe space. I think, and like the policy, or I'm not going to say the name of the church, but there's a church here in the city that is a Catholic church that gender neutralized the entire Mass.
Wow. So including names for God and everything.
Except for the Our Father. That was the only time God was referred with masculineness.
Wow.
And I didn't think I was in a Catholic Mass. I was really confused.
That's how different it was to try to erase the gender binary.
And
in that tradition.
And it wasn't until I heard the priest say, and with Francis our Pope, that I realized I was in a Catholic Mass.
Wow.
And I was like, what is this magical, confusing space? And at the same time, it was so different that I didn't know I was in my religious tradition. And so it's a weird space to be, that I want those spaces, and I want those spaces to feel natural. But at the same time, I get my really Orthodox Catholic Mass is where I get my true nourishment from God, that I know my space. I know, even in my silence and oppression, I know that God isn't the one doing that to me. That God isn't, that when I say God the Father, I don't think of God as the big man in the sky. I think of God as a stained glass window, really, like the big ornate ones that don't have pictures. And that I don't gender father in my head. And so when I go into Catholic Masses where they use that patriarchal language, I don't interpret it on a spiritual level as patriarchal. I understand, like, intellectually and academically and ideologically. You
sort of translate it in your mind.
I translate it in my mind into a kind of gender-neutral term for father.
And when I try to use inclusive language with my family, who are very charismatic, and that, nothing against their tradition, but they often remark to me that I don't, quote unquote, sound Christian to them.
Yeah.
And that, to me, I think sounds like what you're getting at, that we really maybe need to stretch the boundaries of what sounds Christian, and what at the heart of it is Christian in intention, and Christian in practice, and Christian in ultimate meaning.
And that there are ways to bring language to the inclusive level. That is really important.
So that everyone feels made in the image of God.
That everyone feels made in the image of God.
Yeah.
And that's really like I think of, like, my religious community right now is very much a non-Catholic religious community, hence the school I go to. But it's very much I'm learning so much about ways of experiencing God that aren't my way of experiencing God, but it makes me so excited. Like, I hate it when God becomes static. I don't like that. It makes me uncomfortable, because it's like, as soon as I get nervous of when I think I figured God out, because then I know there's something wrong with what I'm thinking, because God is so powerful that God should never be able to be figured out. And so when I went to a pub church, and that was like, they pass out shots of communion wine, and I didn't know what to do. My orthodoxy, I didn't know. But as a very anti-assimilationist, radical queer person, I was like, I should be living for this. Like, this is so unorthodox that my queerness is like, this is what a queer church could look like. And then part of it is also challenging that when I walk into a Catholic Mass, I am queering that space, that is what a queer church looks like too. And that there's no one way of doing anything, but everything can simultaneously be itself.
And God can be in the entirety of the human experience.
Yeah.
For all people.
For all people.
And not to like impose on people who are atheists or
Yeah.
whatever, but really for the way we walk around in the world, that God is
Yeah.
everywhere. God is all the spaces.
Yeah. And part of it is like, there are days where I wish I could be atheist. I really do.
No, it would be easier for me too. It really would.
And I recognize...
It really takes a lot of work to figure all this out.
And I recognize that, like, it's hard to be atheist. Like, I have my atheist friends who have a lot of feelings about how hard it is to be an atheist. I'm like, you're right. Your feelings are valid and your feelings are real. But it's so much easier. It's like your life work isn't crumbling people's faith foundations. But yeah.
Yeah. This has been such a treat.
Yeah.
I'm so glad you were available to do this.
Thanks for having me. This was fun. I like talking about this.
So fun. Yeah. And thank you just for your graciousness and your kindness. It's just so evident how much you love people. Like, I know that sounds like a cheesy thing to say, but I really do mean it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, thank you so much, Nathan. It's been a joy to have you. And we will return with our regular programming on Tuesday. I hope you've enjoyed this time, and we will talk to you soon.